The Italian armed forces have surrendered.
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies...
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone...
The German army coming into surrender.
Scientists have made the atomic bomb.
Japan has today surrendered.
Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
How Radio Won the War. Episode 4. At last, something to cheer about.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're interrupting our advertised program in order to broadcast in a few moments a special Cairo communique which has come in since the 9 o'clock news. Please stand by.
By the end of 1940, it was clear that the threat of invasion had passed. It was equally clear that the war would last for years and that victory was a very distant prospect. The middle period of the war was a very difficult time, as Britain survived the blitz of its major towns and cities, but had no major victories to cheer hearts and minds. The lives of every single citizen, no matter how young or old, had been drastically disrupted. Children separated from parents, husbands from wives, families split up, workers relocated to essential industries, homes destroyed, work disrupted, road and rail transport dislocated, food shortages, clothing shortages, universal rationing. All the multiple inconveniences of the war were lived, day in, day out, by the whole population. In such circumstances, it was vital that the broadcasters got it right. Vital that they provided reliable news and good entertainment. The war was a forcing ground for learning to understand and respect the everyday needs of the population, a lesson that was learned in different ways, both by the state and by the broadcasters. On the 4th of November 1942, Bruce Belfridge made the announcement which heralded the beginning of the end for the Axis countries and the start of the long road to victory for the Allies.
This is the BBC Home and Forces programme. This is Bruce Belfridge. Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour in the form of a communique from GHQ Cairo. It says, the Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat.
Before El Alamein, all had been grey defeat. Now all was victory, and that made a difference to the way that war was reported too. Former war correspondent Frank Gillard.
Our principle always was that we told the truth. Insofar as censorship permitted, reasonable censorship, we told the truth. We told the truth whether it was a success or whether it was a reverse. And we found, as time went on, that there were ways, actually, in which one could report reverses without necessarily damaging morale. I gave you the main example of the Battle of Arnhem, which was a reverse, which we accepted as a reverse, which was obviously a reverse, but we did not conceal the facts. This was revealed, but it was done in heroic language. It was done in ways which made our listeners, our audience, proud of what we had tried to do, recognizing that you can't always win.
The BBC's task was made easier from 1943 by Operation Spartan, which allowed reporters to be widely deployed. The BBC's John Lane says it had a great impact.
It was from then on, I think, that they suddenly realized, yes, this is something to be trusted. And largely the reports which came in, well, of course they weren't free of censorship. They couldn't be. There was no way. But at least there is a very fair argument that the BBC did not rely on interviewing the generals and the press handouts. They went and found the stuff, and they were up in the front line with the guys who were doing it, and it was on disc.
From now on, it was to be victory after victory saturating the airwaves, with a new, lighter, more confident tone. But first, another momentous announcement came, one that surely meant the death knell for the Germans.
Hier ist der Moskauer Rundfunk in deutscher Sprache. Dieser erste Monat des neuen Jahres begann damit, dass die Rote Armee am 1. Januar das von den Deutschen stark befestigte...
The German language service of Radio Moscow, which had earlier informed the Germans that one of their soldiers died in Russia every 6 seconds, now informed them of the defeat of their 6th Army at Stalingrad. Next, the surrender of the Germans in North Africa. Frank Gillard was there.
Yesterday afternoon at about 4:30, the war in North Africa came to an end. Early on Tuesday morning, the Axis armies were cut clean in half by the British drive across the neck of the Cape Bon Peninsula. Our troops in the north put down a smoke screen, and under cover of it they withdrew a little while our bombers went in 3 deadly waves to deliver the last aerial bombardment and one of the heaviest of the whole campaign.
More good news was to come. This on the 25th of July, 1943.
Here's an important piece of news which has just come in. Rome Radio has announced that the King of Italy has accepted Mussolini's resignation. No other details are available yet, but it's expected that more will be known in time for our midnight bulletin.
Later, the announcement of Italy's capitulation was broadcast.
The Italian armed forces have surrendered unconditionally and an armistice has been granted. This news has been given by General Eisenhower in a broadcast from Algiers at 5:30 this afternoon.
The Italian government has surrendered its armed forces unconditionally. As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice, the terms of which have been approved by the government of the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
But despite the victories, there was still a reluctance among broadcasters to portray elements of human suffering that certainly would be reported today. In Germany, there was no attempt at all. In Britain, the attempt was rather half-hearted. Paddy Scannell, media historian at the University of Westminster.
It was partly policy, but again, it was, these were unprecedented circumstances. How does one do it? On the other hand, it is a hostage to fortune. I mean, if you report that widespread civilian panic is the consequence of the bombing, I don't think this is manipulation. I think it's simply common sense that you will want to put a gloss on what is happening in such a way that it, on the one hand, does not lie, on the other hand, does not fully disclose what is happening. And there's almost a circle of impossibility that has to be squared here. There is plenty of evidence that in the way in which, in particular cases, the BBC covered particular incidents, that this caused grief and anger to local populations. On the other hand, the overall picture that I think one gets is that, given the extraordinary difficulty of the task, the BBC did as well as I think it could have been expected to do.
The great man, Winston Churchill, revelled in the chance to use his brilliant oratory in positive speeches.
Since I spoke to you last, not only have the Hun invaders been driven from the lands they had ravaged, but the guts of the German army have been largely torn out by Russian valor and generalship. When the signal is given, the whole circle of avenging nations will hurl themselves upon the foe and batter out the life of the cruelest tyranny which has ever sought to bar the progress of mankind.
There was a lack of challenge from the media which made things easier for politicians during the Second World War. Sir Bernard Ingham, former press secretary to Margaret Thatcher.
The demands upon modern politicians, especially in conflict, and as I observed Mrs. Thatcher in conflict, are inevitably, I think, much greater than they ever were in the pre-televisual age. I think television is really the thing that has changed everything. It's the actuality, as Alan Clark might describe it, and also it's the change in attitude that's partly occurred, I suppose, with television. There is a much greater media arrogance around.
However, despite the comparisons which have been made between Margaret Thatcher and Winston Churchill as leaders in times of crisis, Sir Bernard believes that things were easier for her in 1982.
I don't think Mrs. Thatcher set out to copy Winston Churchill, much though she revered him. And Mrs. Thatcher wasn't exactly prone to go out and talk to the media just like that. I mean, her natural habitat was not journalists, as it were. She was very good on the floor of the House and came over, I think, as a considerable leader. But she didn't make, to the best of my knowledge, a great number of ringing speeches.
Back in 1943, it seemed that even the music had taken on a more optimistic tone, and the American influence was very evident.
You got to accentuate the positive, mind it to negative, latch on to the affirmative, don't mess with
The optimism which was experienced in the latter part of the war did not lead to a relaxation of restrictions of what was reported, or indeed in any let-up in the radio war. Sir Bernard Ingham says that's true of every lull in times of crisis.
It seems to me that when a country goes to war, and lives are at stake, then the overriding concern must be to win the war with the minimum cost of lives. And I had never any difficulty when I was in Number 10 during the Falklands of making that point. I am not here, in the end, to serve the purposes of the media, even if in serving those purposes I might help the government short term. My overriding concern was, first of all, are we going to win the campaign? And secondly, are we going to win it at the minimum cost in life and limb? And that is, in my view, the only responsible approach to it. Now, I think it is the job of the press secretary in those circumstances to cash in, if you like, on every ounce of goodwill that he's got to carry that policy through with the minimum number of broken bones with the media.
One of the key players in the Allied victories, both before and after D-Day, was Montgomery. He certainly had a clear idea of the value of radio, both in terms of morale and propaganda.
Monti used to say, and he said it to me dozens of times, the biggest single factor in battle is morale. If your troops go into battle with high morale, the chances are they will win the battle. Now, he used to say morale is founded on confidence. Confidence in the leadership. Confidence is bred by knowledge of people. They will have confidence in their leaders if they know their leaders. So he went to great lengths to be an ostentatious figure. I mean, he wore peculiar headgear. He wore all sorts of odd uniform. He was always everlastingly up in the forward areas, driving around, being seen, standing up in his jeep, waving to his troops, throwing out packets of cigarettes to them, all that sort of thing. He wanted them to know him. He'd gather them round him if there was a break in the fighting and an opportunity. He'd gather them round, 100, 200, 500, whatever, all round his jeep. He'd stand up on the bonnet of the jeep. It was great for morale, it really was. Now, in those terms, he saw broadcasting as a trump card, and he used it very effectively.
However, Monti was prepared to take advice on how to maximise the impact of his broadcasts.
One day he said to me, I think I'd like to do a broadcast on what people at home could send out to the troops for Christmas. And I said, hey, that's my job. I'm the correspondent. I ought to be doing that sort of thing, that sort of story. I want your appearances on the air to be big occasions. Then they will have the effect that we're both after. I don't want you to be an ordinary, everyday, humdrum broadcaster. And he said at once, yes, you're right. All right, Frank, I forget that. I mean, he would listen to you. He would always say, well, you're the expert, right? You carry on.
The Allies were out to prove their unity, and radio provided a good medium. This Anglo-American production celebrated American Independence Day in 1943. A good opportunity for some positive propaganda.
July the 4th, American Independence Day. Historically, this commemorates the birth of a nation. Today we are concerned with the birth of a world. The revolution continues, and we are in it. America and Britain and all the United Nations.
In the meantime, the onslaught against the Germans and the Japanese went on.
This is the voice of freedom. General MacArthur speaking.
Douglas MacArthur made good his promise to return to the Philippines.
By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil consecrated in the blood of our two people.
And for the Germans, the final blow was coming. The 4th of June, 1944.
England has become one vast ordnance dump and field park. In every wood and copse, in leafy dead-end lanes and side roads, often in private gardens, under quarries and embankments, there it all was. Trucks, ambulances, tanks, armoured cars, carriers, jeeps, bulldozers, ducks, vehicles of all kinds. Vast, really vast numbers of them. Right in the midst of it all, just as I turned for home, I passed a field where 22 men in khaki shirts and battle-dress trousers and heavy hobnail boots were having a quiet knock-up game of cricket.
That summed up what people wanted to hear. The job was about to be done, but it was also quite clear that life would carry on. John Gray explains.
The public wanted reassurance, and the reassurance could come from two forms. The reassurance could come, as far as news was concerned, the feeling that we're being told what matters at fixed times. You knew when to turn into the news, you wanted it clearly. Other than that, you wanted the reassurance that the world is going on. And the complete sending up of the enemy and the affectionate sending up of your own leaders.
Soon the battle was taken to the Nazis.
Wir beginnen mit dem Wehrmachtbericht. Aus dem Führerhauptquartier den 6. Juni. Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt.
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force issued Communiqué number 1. This said, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
With the landing in France came full recognition that radio played a vital role. Radio was more involved in the war effort than ever before, and the fact that victory was at hand made everyone hang on every word. There were also a few key developments that made broadcasters' jobs easier. Frank Gillard.
As the war went on, we persuaded the military authorities, and this is where the help we had from Montgomery was very important, that the BBC should not be treated as another newspaper, that broadcasting should be seen as a different medium, requiring different treatment. And so when we came to land in Normandy, instead of having just one correspondent landing, we had altogether 27. And from then on, a great many of the difficulties we'd experienced previously were overcome because we had people on the spot who could talk about what they had actually seen.
Before D-Day, nothing had been reported live. After Normandy, it was rare for reports to be anything other than live.
When we got to Normandy, there was this new approach towards broadcast coverage. Monti saw broadcasting as an arm of warfare. Monti used to say to me, for the first time in history, I'm a general who can speak to every soldier under his command. I do it through the BBC's microphone. I do it through you. He recognized the importance of this. Therefore, we unquestionably had favored treatment, and broadcasting was at last allowed to show what it could do, so that it was possible for John Snagg in London to say, over to Normandy, within a few days of our landing, and I would be there at the Army signals truck, and I would speak into an Army microphone, and just do my little 3 minutes, and that was it.
Of course, while the war raged, life went on. Radio had to cope with the momentous occasions, like the shape of post-war Britain outlined in the Beveridge Report, a thorny problem for the censors, and the general election, proof positive that life went on in parallel with the war.
It's 9 years since there was a general election. That means that if you're under 30, you've never even had a chance to use your parliamentary vote.
This programme, How to Use Your Vote, was part of a series called Getting Things Done.
And if you're over 30, well, at the last election there were 7.5 million of you who didn't bother to vote at all.
So what?
Well, look at the government that got put in by the ones that did vote.
Well, they say every nation gets the government it deserves. If you ask for Chamberlains, you get them. If you ask for Churchills or an R in Bevans hard enough and often enough, you'll get Churchills and an R in Bevans.
The King's 1944 Christmas message showed the extent to which morale had been lifted, with everyone now looking forward to the post-war world.
Throughout the empire, men and women, and boys and girls have all helped to bring victory nearer. The defeat of Germany and Japan is only the first half of our task. The second is to create a world of free men, untouched by tyranny.
Radio Moscow effectively informed its listeners about the tremendous progress being made by the Red Army.
Карлсхорст, один из берлинских пригородов. Наш микрофон установлен в здании бывшего немецкого военно-инженерного училища.
In the West, it was easier to keep the audience informed. Easier because technical difficulties had been overcome and because we were reporting victories. Of course, there were still major events to be reported.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
I'm watching the sight that we'd hoped we'd see for 6 long years.
Winford Vaughan Thomas watched the Wehrmacht, the once invincible automatons, surrender to the Allies at Lauenburg on the 3rd of May 1945.
The German army coming into surrender, driving into surrender on its own petrol with its own drivers into the British lines. Since 2 o'clock this morning, this endless stream of transport has been pouring through this town, under the white flags hung over the shattered houses by the inhabitants. These people are defeated soldiers. You can see it in their eyes, because this is the end of the German army in the north.
Programs are interrupted by John Snack.
It is understood that in accordance with arrangements between the three great powers, an official announcement will be broadcast by the Prime Minister at 3 o'clock tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon, the 8th of May.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom! God save the King!
Scientists, British and American, have made the atomic bomb at last. The first one was dropped on a Japanese city this morning. It was designed for a detonation equal to 20,000 tons of high explosives. That's 2,000 times the power of one of the RAF's 10-ton bombs of orthodox design.
That was an event greeted with delight by those fearing the implications of an invasion of Japan. John Gray.
I was the chief sub at the time of Hiroshima, and because I had allegedly a technical background, I had to write most of the European service stories on Hiroshima. But the first feeling amongst all of us was thank God, because we'd been expecting that the invasion of Japan was going to cause 3 to 5 million casualties.
Japan has today surrendered.
Britain's new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, made the announcement.
The last of our enemies is laid low. Taking full advantage of surprise and treachery, the Japanese forces quickly overran the territories of ourselves and our allies in the Far East. But the tide turned as the mighty forces of the United States and of the British Commonwealth and Empire and of their allies and finally of Russia were brought to bear.
Radio had found its feet. Paddy Scannell.
It's almost unimaginable to think of the Second World War without broadcasting, precisely because this was a war in which civilian populations were being bombed, because this was a war in which the role of the home front was as important, if not more important, than the fighting front. The continuous day-to-day function of an institution such as the BBC is to keep people in touch. Wartime broadcasting kept people reassured that sort of living as they did and living where they did, that ordinary life continued, that there was entertainment, that you could laugh, that there was music to listen to. So this double function was quite crucial to the very nature of the war. It's impossible to imagine it without radio as an integral feature.
How Radio Won the War is a concept creative production for BBC Radio 5 Live.